All right, everybody, buckle up because this deep dive is going to take us sky high. We're talking air taxis, the electric kind.
Yeah, forget traffic jams.
Right. Imagine just like soaring over rush hour
Mm.
in your own little eco-friendly air taxi. Sounds pretty futuristic, huh?
It does, but, and this is what's really interesting, it's not just a sci-fi dream anymore. I mean, we're talking about real regulatory changes and big investments.
Oh, absolutely. Like this news from the AP about the FAA. They're the ones who make the rules about who can fly what and where. Well, they just came out with a whole new set of rules just for these air taxis.
It's a pretty big deal. They're basically saying these things are important enough to get your own category. It's the first time they have done that since, get this, helicopters.
Since helicopters. I mean, that's got to be like 100 years ago.
Yeah, close to it. And the thing is, these rules aren't just red tape. They're the actual foundation for air taxis to operate, like for real, commercially here in the US. This is about safety standards, pilot training, even how these things are going to fit into the airspace we already have.
So it's like this rule is what companies have been waiting for to really take air taxis from being a cool idea to something you might actually ride in someday.
Exactly. And speaking of companies, have you seen the kind of money some of these startups are getting?
Oh, yeah, it's serious cash. Like Joby Aviation, they've got Delta Airlines and Toyota both backing them. Millions from Delta, and get this, $500 million from Toyota.
That's what caught my eye, too. It shows this isn't just some side project. Big players are seeing dollar signs in the future of transportation. In fact, Joby's CEO, he actually called it clean flight in that AP article.
Clean flight. I like the sound of that. And I guess United Airlines likes it too because they've gone ahead and pre-ordered 200 air taxis from another company called Archer Aviation.
Wow, 200.
Yeah. Can you imagine that? That's potentially a billion-dollar deal.
Yeah, that's a whole lot of faith in this technology.
It really is. But before we get ahead of ourselves, maybe we should back up a bit. When we say air taxi, what are we actually talking about? I mean, these aren't helicopters, right?
No, they're not exactly helicopters. Technically, they're called powered lift aircraft, or sometimes you hear them called eVTOLs.
eVTOLs, okay. What's that stand for?
It stands for Electric Vertical Takeoff and Landing Aircraft.
Catchy. So what makes them different from a helicopter?
Think of it as combining the best of both worlds, kind of like a helicopter and an airplane had a baby.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
So they can take off and land vertically just like a helicopter, which is really important when you're talking about cities with limited space. But then once they're up in the air, they transition to flying like a plane, which is much more efficient, especially for longer distances.
Ah, so that hybrid design lets them operate in cities without needing a runway,
Mhm.
but they can still cover ground quickly. Pretty smart. Yeah. But, and maybe this is a dumb question, how do they actually make that transition from, going straight up to flying straight ahead? Seems a little, I don't know, risky.
It's actually really complex, and that's a big part of why these new FAA rules are so important. So basically, these EV tools, they use a system of several electric motors and propellers that can actually change their orientation.
Wait, the propellers actually move?
Yep. During takeoff and landing, they're angled to push air downwards, like a helicopter. But then, as the air taxi picks up speed, the propellers gradually tilt forward, so they're pushing air backwards, just like an airplane propeller.
So they basically morph in midair. That's incredible. There's got to be some serious tech involved to pull that off safely.
Oh, absolutely. It takes incredibly advanced computer systems, sensors, software, the works, all to control those motors, the propellers, and the flight surfaces throughout that entire transition. And the fact that companies like Joby and Archer are already doing it and attracting those big investments we talked about shows just how far they've come. But it's not all about the tech. The regulations are a huge part of this too. Which brings us back to those new FAA rules.
Right, because you can't have these things just zipping around all over the place.
Hmm.
I mean, especially if they're going to be sharing the skies with, actual airplanes, safety has to be the top priority.
You got it. And that's what those FAA rules are all about. They basically set up a framework for how eVTOLs are going to integrate into the airspace we already have. We're talking pilot training, aircraft certification, how they're going to communicate with air traffic control, even how to handle emergencies. It's pretty comprehensive.
So it seems like they're really trying to think through all the angles and make this as safe as possible, which makes sense. This is all pretty amazing stuff. But with all this talk about rules and regulations and safety, it makes you wonder,
Mm.
how far off is all this really? When could I actually hail an air taxi out in the real world? So
Mhm.
realistically, we could be talking just a few years before this is actually a thing, not a few decades. It's wild. But it also makes you wonder, like, How much is this going to cost? Are we talking like hopping in a cab, or is this going to be more like a private jet kind of situation?
Right. Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, quite literally. And unfortunately, there's no easy answer just yet. There's so many things that'll factor into the price. The length of the trip, obviously, but also the time of day, the company you're flying with, the specific vehicle even, and then, of course, how quickly the technology improves and how much competition there is. Lots to figure out still.
Okay, so no set prices yet. Got it.
Yeah.
But I'm guessing it's not going to be cheap, at least not at first, right?
Probably not, no. Early on, I think it'll definitely be more of a premium service, like business travelers who need to get to the airport fast or
Yeah.
people who are willing to pay extra to avoid traffic altogether.
Right, right.
But as production ramps up and the technology gets more efficient, the prices should start to come down. At least that's what everyone's hoping for.
Yeah, that makes sense. Usually you see that with new tech, right?
Mm.
The early adopters pay a premium, and then it becomes more mainstream. Kind of like what happened with, I don't know, smartphones or flat screen TVs, that kind of thing.
Exactly. And like we were saying before, the fact that these big companies like Delta and United are investing so heavily, it suggests they see a real path to profitability. So that's got to be a good sign, right?
It does, yeah. But even if it does get cheaper, this isn't just about replacing taxis or Ubers, is it? This feels much bigger than that. Like we could be talking about a total shift in how we think about transportation, especially in cities.
Absolutely. It's
Yeah.
potentially transformative, although it's worth remembering that bigger isn't always better, right? I mean, there's
Right,
maybe some
right, right.
downsides to all of this, some challenges to overcome.
That's true. We touched on safety earlier, but what else should people be thinking about? What are some of the potential drawbacks?
Well, one of the big ones is noise pollution. Even if these eVTOLs are significantly quieter than helicopters, imagine what it's going to sound like with hundreds, maybe even thousands of these things flying over cities.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I hadn't even thought about that. It's like we're adding a whole other layer of traffic, but in the air.
Exactly. And that's going to require some careful planning. Noise mitigation strategies, designated air taxi routes, maybe even noise restrictions at certain times. Cities are going to have to adapt.
It's like they're designing a whole other dimension to cities, one that exists up in the sky. Pretty mind-blowing. Are there any cities that are already, starting to plan for this that you know of?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. There are a bunch of cities all over the world that are already thinking about how to integrate air taxis into their urban planning. Like, for example, Paris is developing this whole network of vertiports.
Vertiports? Okay, what's that?
It's basically like a landing pad for air taxis. And the idea is to connect all the key locations throughout the city. And then you've got Dubai. They're actually already testing self-flying autonomous air taxis. Their goal is to make a quarter of all their transportation driverless by 2030.
Wow. Dubai's going all in on that futuristic vision, huh?
It's pretty impressive.
It is. It makes you think, though. It's not just about the tech, is it? I mean, what about the social and economic implications of all this? We were talking before about the cost and how, at least initially, it's going to be pretty expensive to ride in one of these things. So doesn't that mean that only the wealthy will be able to afford it? And then you end up with this two-tiered transportation system, right? The rich get to zip around above the traffic, and everyone else is stuck down at street level.
It's definitely a valid concern, and frankly, it's something that needs to be addressed head on. If air taxis become just another luxury good, something only the wealthy can afford, then it could definitely widen the gap between the haves and the have-nots. It's crucial to make sure everyone has access to this technology, not just a select few.
Yeah, equity has to be a part of this conversation from the very beginning. This can't just be about creating some cool new toy for rich people, right? It's about creating a fairer and more equitable system for everyone. Okay, so let's say we figure out the noise pollution and the cost and the whole equity thing. There's still one big question that's kind of bugging me. The environmental impact. I mean, we keep hearing about how these things are electric, so they're good for the environment. But is it really that simple?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And the truth is, it's complicated. Yeah, electric propulsion means you're getting rid of those direct tailpipe emissions, which is great. But we've got to look at the bigger picture. How are they generating the electricity to power these things? What about the environmental costs of making the batteries and the vehicles themselves? And what about the fact that we could end up with way more air traffic? That can't be good for emissions.
Right. It's like we can't just swap out gas for electric and call it a day. We've got to think about the entire system.
Exactly. It's like that old saying, there's no such thing as a free lunch, or in this case, a free flight.
Huh. Good one. So, to be truly environmentally friendly, these air taxis need to be part of a much larger shift, a shift towards cleaner energy and more sustainable ways of getting around.
I think that's exactly right. We're talking about investing in renewables, improving battery technology, making sure people have other good options like walking, cycling, public transportation, that kind of thing.
Right, because even if air taxis become super common and affordable, they can't be the only solution. We need to be looking at all of it. But going back to the environmental piece for a second, what are some of the things that are going to determine whether this is actually a good thing for the planet or not?
Well, for me, the biggest factor is going to be the source of the electricity. If we're still relying on fossil fuels to generate electricity, then all the benefits of electric air taxis kind of disappear.
Makes sense.
We need to be transitioning to cleaner sources like solar, wind, hydropower, all of that. If we're going to decarbonize transportation, that's what it's going to take.
So the environmental impact is really going to come down to how we make electricity, huh? It's like the air taxis themselves can be electric, but if they're running on dirty energy, it kind of defeats the purpose.
Yeah, for sure. It's about the whole picture. Like we got to look at the entire life cycle of these things, from building them to flying them to what happens when they're done.
Right, like what are they made of? How much energy does it take to build one and get it to where it needs to go? And then what do you do with it when it's like out of service?
Those are the questions, yeah. We can't get so caught up in the excitement of this new tech that we forget to think about the consequences, right?
Absolutely. It just feels like with all this talk about the future and how tech is going to change everything, it's easy to forget that we have a choice in how it all plays out.
100%. And that's why I think these conversations are so important, especially now while this tech is still in its early stages. We have a chance to really shape how it develops, to make sure it aligns with what we want for the future, a future that's more sustainable and more equitable.
Totally. I love that. It's like, yeah, air taxis are super cool and all, but it's really about the bigger picture, right? Kind of world we want to live in.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing is, I'm actually feeling pretty optimistic about it because you can see that people are starting to get it.
Right.
Policymakers, academics, even everyday people, investors, we're all starting to demand better, more sustainable products, more responsible practices, and companies are starting to respond, which is huge.
You're right. That is hopeful. Like we're at this point where we're realizing that we can't keep doing things the same old way. We got to be willing to like shake things up.
Exactly. We got to be willing to try new things, to experiment, to challenge the status quo. That's what's so exciting about this moment in time. We have the opportunity to completely reimagine our cities, how we get around, even our relationship with the planet. It's pretty amazing when you think about it.
It really is. But it takes all of us, right?
Yeah.
We all got to be on board, be open to new ideas, work together.
Absolutely.
Well, on that note, I think it's time for us to come in for a landing on this deep dive into the world of air taxis. And I think the main thing to remember is this: stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged. Because the future isn't something that just happens to us. We all have a hand in creating it.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Until next time, keep exploring.